the number one question, without a doubt, was when was it written? Now, do you have any idea why? Anybody? Dan?
Because of the controversy, is this talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or is this talking about the end of time or whatever? Something in that category.
Okay. There are two basic interpretations in the church, used in the church about Revelation. Okay? Two basic ones. Now, there are several others, and I'll quickly name two or three others for you here in a minute. But there are two basic interpretations that are used in the church. One of them, and they're both what we call preterist interpretations. Everything is basically past. Everything is finished. Everything is done. One of them says that it was all finished in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay? That is probably the least of the two. The second one is that it was all fulfilled and it was all came to fruition in the destruction of Rome in about 460. So the debate is over two questions, or two different opinions of what the book means. If you believe that it was all came to end or all fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem, it had to be written in, if Jerusalem was destroyed in 70, it had to be written in approximately 68 at least. Okay? If it were written after the destruction of Jerusalem and Rome was the issue, then it was written sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem, according to this line of thinking. So you have two groups, and they're battling over which one of these is correct. And if one can prove it was written at 68, then that makes that theory correct. If one can prove it was written in 95, that makes that theory correct. Okay? Well, I don't believe either one of them. I'll just tell you right straight up front. I don't think either one of them has anything to do with the book of Revelation, practically. I think that debate is like two people debating for 150 years over whether my hair's red or blonde. Okay? Because it's not either one, is it? So we have the debate going on in the brotherhood over these two lines of thinking. Now, there are other lines of thinking in this, and that is that there's a chronological order. Some people believe it's chronological in order, come to the end of time. And those are some in the church. Then there's some that believe it's kind of a philosophy of history where things are fulfilled time and again. And I hold to that a little bit throughout the ages. And then, of course, there are premillennial views. Did you realize there are premillennial views in the church? In fact, in Louisville, Kentucky, was at one time probably the best known place in the brotherhood that taught premillennialism in the church. So there are a lot of things have gone on, or a lot of different ways of looking at the book of Revelation. Now, let me just ask you, how many of you are settled in on an interpretation of this book? How many of you really, really honestly believe that you know what this book's talking about? Brendan, all right? Anybody else? All right? That's what we run into. Dan, you want to tell us which way you go with it?
I feel comfortable with the book of Revelation. For years, I didn't feel comfortable till I was in your class, and I feel much more comfortable feeling like I know the message of it. But I'm not an expert.
Okay, well, I'm not either. You know, the definition of an expert is when he's more than 50 miles away from home. So I'm certainly not that. Well, I appreciate you saying that. Well, anyway, the problem that we run into in the church is that there are many people who are definitely settled on it. And believe me, if they are, you don't change them. Okay? I'm telling you now, you don't. Just forget it. I've tried for years, and it don't work. Well, anyway, so what I want to take just a couple more minutes, and then we'll get into the book. If you are looking at Revelation and you are trying to determine how you are going to interpret that book, then there's different lines of reasoning like I've told you here. If you take one, you got to stay with it. You can't mix and match. Okay, because if you think it's the destruction of Jerusalem is where it all came to fruition, you can't mix and match over here with Rome. They just don't mesh up. Okay, and what I'm about to show you here in a little bit doesn't mesh either. So what you have to do is kind of like making taking a recipe. And if you got a recipe, and I'm no cook, so I don't know it, but I know this much. If you got a recipe and that recipe is for chocolate pie, okay, you take that and you make that. So that would be one line of thinking. If you've got another recipe over here and it's for coconut cake, you make the cake with that recipe, but you don't mix them. Right? You cannot mix them. You cannot take part of this recipe and part of this recipe, put them together and come out with anything, can you? So you have to stick with what you're looking at. And that's true. Well, today we're going to make peach cobbler, okay? We're going to do peach cobbler today, and we're going to stick with it. All right. Just quickly, I believe that Revelation basically is talking about the church. Talking about the church. Now, what kind of handle do we have on that today? What are some names in the Bible about the church? Brethren. All right, we're brethren. What are some names of the church in the Bible? Kingdom, Church of God, Kingdom. More? Church of the Firstborn. All right, there's a couple more I'd like for you to come up with. Pardon? Church of Christ. Think. I'm not pressuring you, you know. I'm up here having a good time. Any more? The church. The church. Saints. Church of the, okay, called out. Where are the called out? There's one more that's just real common that we talk about, and that's the one I'm looking for. Body of Christ. Body of Christ, all right. If we're married to God, who are we? The bride of Christ. Bride of Christ. Everybody will agree with that, okay? All right. Now, the reason, and this is, and I know this is hard to take and hard to swallow if you haven't ever heard it. But the reason we do not understand the book of Revelation, now, I'm as convinced of this as I'm convinced that I'm standing here right now, about to sit on my stool. The reason we don't understand it is because we don't correctly interpret chapter 21, verse 9. Everybody turn to chapter 21, verse 9. I start with this verse every time I teach it. And I'm going to do it again. Now, I do realize that it goes against the grain of thinking of 90% of people. No, I don't believe it's that much. But anyway, chapter 21, verse 9 says, "And there came unto me one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials full of the 7 plagues," last plagues, "and talked with me, saying, Come here, and I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." What did the angel show John? That's one of the easiest questions you've ever been asked. But for many, many people, it's one of the hardest ever to accept. Because what do we interpret these last 2 chapters as being? What have we always interpreted these last 2 chapters as being? Heaven. But what does the Bible say he's going to show him? The church. Now, there are some passages in there that just absolutely just explode out and makes you think it's talking about heaven. But it's not. It's talking about the church. Now, you probably, so honestly, folks, and the reason that it's been 35 years for me and I haven't been able to scratch the surface hardly, and that's not true. I can tell you a lot of things that have happened to the good. And she reminds me of that every once in a while. But we have to understand that the church is what's being described in these last 2 chapters. Now, how in the world can that be? Number one, that's what it says it is. Now, in the church, we said God said it, that's, I believe it, and that settles it, except for chapter 21:9 in Revelation. Because everybody say that's heaven. It's not. It's not heaven. What kind of entity is the church? Is it bricks and mortar? You know, that's what we say all the time, isn't it? It's not brick and mortar. It is what?
Souls that have come to Christ.
It is spiritual, isn't it? It's spiritual. Now, what does it mean for the church to be spiritual? Well, we can start out by saying it's not what?
Not a denomination.
Well, it's not spiritual. If it's spiritual, it's not. It's not what? It's not physical, is it? If it's spiritual, it's not physical. It's so hard for us to wrap our minds around that. We preach, I have heard that all my life, and you have too, that the church is spiritual. It's not physical. It's not brick and mortar. We come into this building, are we coming into the church? No. How do we get into the church?
Obey the gospel.
All right, we obey the gospel. We are baptized into the church. Who built that church? Christ. So that church is what? It's not physical, it's what? It's spiritual. Can you see something spiritual? No. We see what? Physical. 1 Corinthians says, for the things which are seen or temporal or temporary. But the things which are not seen are what? Eternal. You cannot lay your physical eyes on the church. Now, you can see all the people around here that are members of the church, right? And we make up the church, but what did Jesus build? He built the church, right? Upon this rock I will build my church. So is the church physical or spiritual? What did Jesus build? He built the church, which is spiritual. Can you see a spiritual building? No, you cannot, can you? You cannot see a spiritual building because you cannot see anything spiritual. Right? There are things in this world that we can kind of equate that to. Can you see love? Cannot see it, can you? But you know it's present by what? The actions of it, yes, the results. So you cannot see the church. Now, if God is going to describe something to us that is spiritual, key issue here, how must it be done? How would he have to describe something that is spiritual to us? What about the parables? What was he doing in the parables? He gave a spiritual lesson by using what? Physical situations and things that we knew something about.
Somebody was blind and you were trying to explain something to them, you have to be very descriptive.
Sure, absolutely. Now, the only way that we can see and know what something spiritual is to have it described to us in physical terms that we understand. Okay? Does that make sense yet? The only way we can understand or see something spiritual from God is if God describes it in physical terms that we understand. All right, I'm going to do it just quickly. I'm just going to look. You know you've read Revelation 21 and 22 lots of times, I'm sure. So in there it describes the foundation of the church being garnished with all manner of precious stones. Ephesians 2:19-20 said, you are come, Ephesians 2, somebody was talking about memorizing the other day. If I get the first word, I can go. If I don't, I can't. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 20 and 21, very common verses for us. Ye are now no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. What's the household of God? The church, sure. And are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. What's the foundation of the church? The teachings of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ being the chief cornerstone. So in Revelation, it talks about the foundation of the church being garnished with all manner of precious stones. What's the foundation of the church? The teachings of the Bible. What the apostle gave us. What Jesus gave us. What we have in our hand in order to understand it. That's the foundation. Why is that the foundation? Well, it's built on something that'll never change, isn't it? Never crumble. It'll be the same forever. And it talks about the walls of the church. Why walls? We'll do this more in depth later. But the Old Testament cities, what they built around them? Around Jericho, there was a huge. Why was that wall there? Protection. Kept the enemies out, right? The wall of the church is a wall of salvation.
But Lonnie, when Christ said, talking about Peter, to him, it says, on this rock I will build my church.
Yeah.
So Peter's one of the apostles. So did he mean Peter?
No, he meant that the rock was, in that situation, the statement that Peter made that Jesus Christ was the Son of God.
Oh, okay.
Church is built on Jesus Christ, the rock, the solid rock, the rock of our foundation.
But then over here in Ephesians,
Right.
on the foundation of the apostles.
Well, sure, but how did we get the word? We got it through the apostles, the Old Testament, got it through the prophets, and we still get it today. But and it talks about the light of the church. And it talks about once you figure out what you're dealing with here, and you understand that it's being described in physical terms, but it's a spiritual church. The truth of the teachings of the apostles is not physical, is it? It's spiritual. So the spiritual foundation of the church is the teachings of the apostles. It's what we have written down is Jesus Christ. So he uses physical things that we know and understand to describe what the church really is. So the number one thing, in order to understand, I've got 2 minutes here. In order to understand Revelation, there are two things you got to know. Two. One of them is this. I can pick up a book. A book has been recently written on Revelation, turn to 21:9, and I know whether they are going in any right direction or not, honestly. Because it describes the church that we live in today as Christians. Not what we're going to have in heaven. Are we going to heaven? Is the church going to be taken to heaven? The kingdom will be delivered to heaven. But what do we have today? We have the church, and the church is spiritual, and it's being described to us in physical terms in these last two chapters. Now, does that make sense? Have I totally lost anybody?
Not till you get into the physical descriptions.
Well, but those will be easy.
Sure.
No, they will be. And the reason for that, and I'll end with this, but the reason for that is because in order to understand what that description is talking about, all you have to do is go back to the Old Testament and look at a prophecy of the church. Say that one more time. All you have to do is go back to the Old Testament and look at a prophecy of the church, and you'll find it in Revelation 21 and 22. I'll give you the illustration. I'll do this one because I started a while ago. The wall of the church. What's the wall of the church? Does the church have a wall? Isaiah 26, verses 1 and 2 says, in that day, what day? Prophecy of the church. In that day shall this city have shall be a strong city with walls and bulwarks. What's he talking about? He's prophesying of what? The church. He said, in that day this city shall have walls and bulwarks. Salvation will God appoint for walls. So what's the wall of the church? separation from the world, our salvation. How strong is that salvation? Can anybody take it away from us? We can give it up ourselves, but could it ever be taken away from us? Never. The wall is a wall of salvation. It's a spiritual wall, isn't it? That is unbreakable. Can anybody overpower God and come in and take our salvation away from us? Cannot do it, right? So that wall is a wall of salvation. And that's the way you do everything in those last two chapters. You go to prophecies and you come back over to see what its fulfillment is in those last two chapters. So read Revelation 21 and 22 4 or 5 times between now and next week. And that's what we'll do. Okay?
Found these notes from another sermon from the